Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The very first summit between President Lee Jae-myung and U.S. President Donald Trump ran well past schedule, a sign of just how much was at stake. For over 2 hours, the two leaders placed peace on the Korean Peninsula, the strength of the alliance, and future cooperation at the heart of their talks. It was a meeting that mixed powerful symbolism with hard questions, from North Korea and economic cooperation to defense costs, leaving the world to ask, was this just another summit or the beginning of a new chapter in these whole Washington relations? So to help us break all these down, we're joined by Evans Revere, former Acting Assistant Secretary of State and non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. A big welcome.
Great to be with you.
And also joining us is Han-na Kim, Associate Professor at the Seogang University's GSIS. Good to see you, Professor.
Thanks for having me again.
So let's begin our discussion with Mr. Revere. So President Lee's first summit with President Trump, it lasted 140 minutes, about 20 minutes longer than what was expected. What does this extended length and overall tone tell us about the current state of the alliance?
Well, I wouldn't draw any conclusions about the summit based solely on the length of time of the meeting, quite frankly. As you pointed out a moment ago, the two leaders had a very long and complicated agenda to discuss. And so it's no surprise that the meeting ran over the scheduled time. This happens very often at summits, as I can attest from personal experience over the years. I think a much more important indicator of the outcome of the summit was the Oval Office meeting where the media was present. By any reasonable measure, that meeting went extremely well, and it also, quite frankly, defied the expectations of many, including me. But you pointed out the tone of the overall summit, and I think that's an important thing to focus on. As you may know, my academic expertise is in the history of China-Korea relations. And in that context, as I watched that Oval Office meeting and watched how President Lee handled it, I found the summit a remarkable reminder of the skill that Koreans have developed over many centuries in managing relations with a powerful state, dealing with delicate policy and economic differences, understanding the importance of things like ritual and protocol and flattery, in dealing with a powerful and eccentric leader, and understanding that there is a big difference between political performance and diplomatic progress. President Lee gave us a masterclass in all of those things in that Oval Office meeting with President Trump. President Lee understood Trump's psychology, and it showed in the way the meeting in the Oval Office unfolded. President Lee ensured that the discussion focused largely on the one topic on which he and President Trump mostly agree, North Korea. Other more contentious topics, difficult topics, were left to the closed-door session. And I think President Lee understood also that these Oval Office sessions are designed to be performative, and he played his role very, very skillfully, helping set, I think, that positive tone that I mentioned.
Right. So it really seemed like a huge diplomatic development strategy in terms of diplomacy, of course. We also want to hear Professor Kim's opinion. What was your takeaway?
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Revere. You know, this extended duration really did indicate that there were a lot of broad issues that needed to be covered. You know, because of the political vacuum that South Korea was in, it really prevented and delayed a much needed summit. And as you mentioned, because the meeting had originally been scheduled for 120 minutes, but it lasted 20 minutes more, it was a total of 140 minutes. So in diplomatic practice, this type of extension can suggest two things. One, either that there were some significant disagreements that required additional time to reconcile, or two, more positively, that the leaders had a wide range of substantive issues to discuss beyond the pre-agreed agenda. And considering that President Lee and President Trump emerged from the talks in visibly good spirits, in this context, it's very likely that the latter explanation seems more likely. So in many ways, in addition to reaffirming the strength of the U.S.-ROC alliance and exploring avenues such as deeper cooperation in shipbuilding, the two leaders also engage in meaningful discussions on a number of additional fronts. So we can see that with the extended time.
Right, so it was very clear that the duration itself tells us something about how much was on the table and the amicable atmosphere over there. Now, one of the most sticking points of the summit, many say, was President Lee's praising of President Trump as a, quote, peacemaker, and he even joked that he would serve also as a pacemaker. Mr. Revere, I wonder, how did you see this? As a former U.S. diplomat who has experience in negotiating with North Korea as well, how do you assess the diplomatic significance of this framing?
Well, I'm not at all surprised to discover that President Lee hopes to play an intermediary role in the possible resuscitation of U.S.-North Korea dialogue. I think that explains his use of the word pacemaker, being in the background and sometimes in the foreground, nudging things along in a direction in which he'd like to see things go. I certainly understand his motivation, but things have changed dramatically since the earlier Trump-Kim summits. North-South Korea relations have become more hostile. Seoul-Pyongyang channels have basically dried up, and North Korea has made it bluntly clear that it does not regard South Korea as a legitimate diplomatic partner going forward. This, in fact, tells me that the North Koreans are likely to reject any overtures from the ROK, as it already has in recent days. We've seen this occur over the last several days. I think from Kim Jong-un's perspective, if there is any U.S. DPRK dialogue to be had, it's going to be one that's arranged directly without any intervention by Seoul. I'm fairly sure that will be North Korea's position. I should also add, I think it's important to remember that Kim Yo-jong recently reminded us that the price of admission for such a future dialogue between the United States and North Korea would be de facto U.S. acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear power and the end of any talk about denuclearization. And that's something that Seoul is going to have, or would have, a major problem with. So this is a very complicated matter, trying to develop this sort of triangular relationship. But it's a relationship that I think Pyongyang is no longer interested in, quite frankly. And they're making that clear. And I don't know that they will change that position, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. So having heard Pyongyang's such stance on that, it seemed it was a deliberate diplomatic signal from President Lee's part to avoid being sidelined. We'll have to keep close tabs on that. Now, staying with this theme, the summit also included appeals for President Trump to re-engage with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Professor Kim, how do you interpret this message to Pyongyang in the broader context of inter-Korean relations?
So I think some of these, this was already mentioned, but President Lee has made it clear that he cannot resolve this North Korea issue on his own, and that only President Trump has the leverage to do so. And this was in part a deliberate effort to flatter Trump, something that President Lee employed more than once during the summit. And his remark about the ornate decoration of the Oval Office, symbolizing America's bright future, is a telling example of what we would describe as praise diplomacy. And yet his statement also carries a degree of truth. So since taking office, the Lee administration has pursued more conciliatory gestures towards Pyongyang, such as dismantling South Korea's loudspeaker system along the border. But, as has been mentioned already, North Korea has not sufficiently reciprocated, and it continues to instead uphold the doctrine of the South and the North as two hostile states. And so at present, Pyongyang shows very little inclination to engage directly with Seoul. And by contrast, although its relationship with Washington remains relatively adversarial, North Korea has not entirely foreclosed the possibility of dialogue with the United States. So against this backdrop, the resolution of the nuclear issue and the creation of a more peaceful climate on the Korean Peninsula, it really hinges on U.S. involvement. And President's appeal really reflects both a strategic reading of the regional dynamics as well as a recognition that meaningful progress with Pyongyang is more likely to be achieved through Washington than through Seoul alone.
Right. So, despite North Korea's speaking of their, preconditions for resumption of dialogue between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, we just want to ask if this meeting actually would realize, Mr. Revere, when could it actually realistically take place? And do you think the upcoming APEC summit in Korea could provide that opportunity?
Well, if there were actual U.S. DPRK agreement on renewed dialogue, I suspect the schedule and the venue issues would be fairly minor. And they would be the meeting would be organized rather quickly, especially since Donald Trump, by his own admission, is eager to have such a meeting. Meeting on the margins of the APEC summit would be an interesting option. And it's one that actually might really appeal to President Trump. But in light of the current state of North-South relations, for me at least, it's difficult to see how North Korea would be able to accept a meeting on South Korean soil at this moment. They would really have to have a major shift in their policy and their overall approach towards the South. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of enthusiasm for the North Koreans by the North Koreans for the idea of a summit on the margins of APEC, but one never knows.
Right. We'll have to see how it goes. Now, let's also touch upon the economy side. Multi-billion-dollar cooperation was announced in shipbuilding, energy, and aviation as well. Professor Kim, beyond commerce, how do these outcomes strengthen the political alliance between the two countries?
Yeah, so, in the summit, President Trump really placed a lot of emphasis on cooperation in shipbuilding. He lamented that the United States once had the capacity to launch a vessel a day, but no longer possesses such capabilities. And he openly appealed for South Korea to invest in U.S. shipyards and employ American workers. So for Washington, the revival of its shipbuilding industry is not merely a matter of reshoring manufacturing jobs. It's also carries strategic weight in countering China. Now, at present, the United States lacks the domestic conditions to rebuild the sector independently and completely. So given that the global shipbuilding market is dominated by two major players, China and South Korea, the collaboration with South Korea really emerges as Washington's main viable option. And even beyond shipbuilding, the two leaders also pledged cooperation in energy and aviation. So in highlighting these ties, I think President Trump is pointedly referring to advanced American military platforms such as the B-2 bomber. These kinds of linkages are essentially underscoring that for the United States, these agreements are not just commercial in nature, right? They have to serve to reinforce the security dimension of the alliance. So South Korea's acquisition of American weapon systems provides Washington with economic benefits while simultaneously enhancing South Korea's role in regional stability. So in this way, the economic outcomes of the summit really extend beyond commerce and embed the alliance more deeply in both strategic and industrial terms.
Right. So it really does seem economic dimension is woven tightly into political alliance as well. Now, let's talk about security now. President Trump has continued to press Korea on defense cost sharing. And with this pressure resurfacing, how do you think Seoul should respond without weakening the alliance, Mr. Revere?
Well, I understand that the ROK's National Security Advisor, Ambassador Lee Sung-lak, remarked after the summit that there had been no discussion of increasing ROK burden sharing costs during the summit. I found that curious and somewhat surprising, since this has obviously been talked about quite a bit by Washington policymakers, and it's been obviously a U.S. priority. It's possible that the two sides agreed to defer concrete discussion of this difficult topic and relegate it to ongoing bilateral exchanges. And so we'll have to see in the coming days and weeks if this topic is put on the table again for discussion. This is one of several very thorny issues that do not appear to have been resolved at the summit. So for all of the my positive talk about the tone of the summit, in terms of substance, other than the economic and trade issues, and in terms of the overall tone, the positiveness of the summit, we didn't see a lot of specific progress on the very many thorny issues that exist between the two sides. For example, strategic flexibility, the level and deployment status of U.S. forces in Korea, and of course, ROK interest in revising the U.S. ROK nuclear cooperation agreement. So these are all sensitive topics, difficult topics, topics that we know for a fact. There are differing views between Seoul and Washington. And so we'll just have to see how they are dealt with in the coming weeks. And I think South Korea has already developed its strategy on how to deal with this. And we'll see how that plays out as the coming weeks unfold.
Mm-hmm. But even though, there was no direct mention of defense costs during the summit itself, President Trump actually touched upon raising the issue of U.S. ownership of American baseland in South Korea. Professor Kim, do you see this as some kind of a bargaining rhetoric or as a signal of a deeper shift in America's policy?
Actually, in my view, this was one of the most striking moments of the summit. During the talks, President Trump claimed that 40,000 U.S. troops were stationed in South Korea and that their bases were leased from Seoul. He went so far as to suggest that the United States should hold outright ownership of these facilities. So on several counts, this assertion was factually inaccurate. The actual number of U.S. forces in Korea is around 28,000, and American bases are not leased but granted under the terms of the ROK-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, Article 4, and the Status of Forces Agreement in Article 2. But President Lee actually chose not to correct these errors at the moment. And I think in many ways that may have been a wise decision given the overall atmosphere of the meeting because it was relatively positive. But setting aside these factual issues, Trump's suggestion of U.S. ownership touches directly on questions of South Korea's territorial sovereignty. It's something that no South Korean government could possibly accept. But were a Korean president even, were able to entertain such an idea, the domestic backlash would be immense. So Trump himself surely understands this, and I think he still raised the matter as a rhetorical posturing rather than substantive policy shift. He has made these kinds of comments before about the Gaza Strip and Greenland, and none of it really translated into concrete moves to alter sovereignty. So in this light, I think his remarks appear to be more about theatrics, political theatrics, and bargaining leverage rather than about signaling and a genuine reorientation of U.S. policy.
Right, so this ownership issue clearly takes the debate into new and more delicate territory. But I want to ask Mr. Revere how you found Trump's latest remarks. It was the first time to do so, right?
On this specific issue, yeah, I hadn't heard that before. I have to tell you, when I was watching the remarks on television, my first thought was that this was not some sort of conspiratorial thing that Donald Trump had cooked up to put President Lee on the spot, although I can't completely dismiss that. My first thought was that Donald Trump was just misinformed about the reality. I can see in a briefing that he might have asked a question of his briefers about the bases, and somebody may have used the word, well, these facilities and areas are given to us, they're leased to us on an open-ended basis, and when we're done using them, we return them to the Republic of Korea. And he may have fixated as a real estate person on this word lease. So for a change, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and chalk it up to a mistake rather than some conspiracy.
Mm-hmm. Right. So before we let you go, then could you point for us what kind of a specific opportunity from this latest summit do you think could help transform Seoul-Washington alliance into a truly future-oriented partnership?
Well, I was thinking about that as President Lee gave his remarks at CSIS. And in those remarks, he stated his government's intention to boost military spending. He did it in very forceful terms, and he talked about a future ROK military capability and budgetary capability that would help expand the ROK's military role in the alliance. And I interpreted that latter comment, the role of in the alliance, as a reference to transfer of OPCOM, operational control transfer, a very long-standing and contentious issue. These topics were presumably discussed behind closed doors at the summit. And I expect that the U.S. and the ROK are going to continue to discuss these matters via ongoing consultations after the summit. And progress on those two issues and other things, I think, would be a major development in the alliance, and I think would go a long way towards achieving the future-oriented strategic partnership that both countries seek. So I think that things are moving in a positive direction. We didn't see many issues in this area resolved during this conversation between the two leaders. But once again, as you pointed out at the outset, tone is everything here, and the tone here was positive and constructive. And so let's hope things can continue to move in this very appealing direction.
Right. So we'll hope to see some progress on some sensitive issues that haven't been discussed yet at the summit, after the summit. We'll have to conclude our discussion here at this point, but thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight, Mr. Revere.
You're welcome.
And Professor Kim, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.